The webinar is about to begin. Please stand by.
Hi, everyone. I hope all of you can hear me. Hello? There we go. I hope everybody can hear me. So let me just present my screen. Just one second. Here we go. I hope I'm audible. Perfect. So let me also give you a little bit of a background about our presenter today. So Adrian is an experienced executive specializing in M&A, strategy and execution, leadership and team building. He is a keynote speaker and CEO of Rocket Fitness and Qualson. He is also a contributing author to Forbes Business Council and serves as a faculty member at the Institute for Mergers, Acquisitions, and Alliances. And he also brings wealth of skills and experience in strategic planning, coaching, and executive leadership. So I'm really excited to attend his webinar today. So I hope you guys all are too. Hi, Adrian.
Yeah,
How are you doing?
good. It's never a webinar without some technical glitch at the start. So well done.
Indeed. Thank you so much for your patience as well. And you can now go ahead and proceed.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining. I'm very privileged to be here, and we're going to be talking about change management's role in M&A culture clash. So before I present, what would be great to see in the comments, and I see that some of you guys, Karen and Dominic, you've been commenting in the chat. What I would like to ask whoever's on this call is that what is culture to you? So just before we kick off and I start to talk, please put in the comments, what does culture mean to you? So that's a request to everybody that's on this call. So drop in what your version of what culture is, and then I'll start. So in terms of culture, what I've seen as a practitioner is that it's one of the main things that actually derails transactions. So I got into this a little bit about me. I got into M&A because I found that when I was doing my MBA, I was sitting looking at my final year dissertation paper, and I was thinking, what can I actually contribute to this endeavor? And as I was reading the FT, I saw another transaction that didn't succeed, and one of the things that was brought out was that 70% failure rate, and I dug deep into that, and my last dissertation paper was on integration, change management, and people. So whilst you might get some very intelligent people with Excel spreadsheets working out discounted cash flows on a transaction, really the business of business is people, and having a focus on people integration and working through culture is really one of the key things that makes M&A success. Erin, awesome. Yeah, norms, behaviors of a group, completely relate to that. Catherine, some makeup of a business and what's accepted, behaviors and actions. Yes, similar vibe. Karen, you got there. It's usually ignored when considering starting to change. Yes, and I'll be keen to understand a little bit more about that. Please elaborate. Critical to understand how things are done and what needed to support the success of the change for the individuals. 100%. So before I present slides, because I don't want this to be death by PowerPoint, I am a practitioner. I've done 59 transactions now, predominantly on the integration side. However, a lot of the work that I've been involved in has been as a workstream lead in post-merger integration, focusing on people and people integration. Now, culture clash is given as a reason for failure in a lot of transactions, and there's two reasons for that. Number one, the due diligence hasn't considered undertaking a cultural assessment, and we'll go into what that looks like and why that's important and how that should filter through then to your post-merger integration plan. What I love about what Karen just mentioned there in terms of individuals, the one thing that we need to ensure that we have on day one is a clarity of purpose, and that comes through your communications. And how do people in not just the target firm but also the acquiring firm, what is their purpose and how does it contribute to the overall success of the transaction? I'll give you an example to make this, crystallize this. On a recent transaction, the CEO said, well, we're doing this transaction because we want to increase our top line revenue. And I said, well, okay, well, that might be a goal, but you're not going to get people on board, and you need to have something that's personal to each individual. So if there's only one takeaway you get from this in terms of change management's role in M&A culture clash, it's doing your due diligence prior to day one and ensuring that you understand the culture of the business and the way things are done. Now, the takeaway is that just because things are different doesn't mean it's bad. It normally means that that's where you have to have a little bit more focus. I'll share with you on my screen a cultural assessment tool that I use as I go through due diligence. And that's something that maybe you guys would want to consider as well. See that there's collective personality of an organization model from the top down to senior leadership. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Culture does come from the top. It's set from the top. I'm sure that a lot of you on this call have been in a situation where maybe the messaging doesn't actually filter down. So I would say that's where the walk isn't matching the talk. And that's something that really gets people, I suppose, not incentivized or emotionally attached to a transaction. So in those kinds of situations, what you would want to do is ensure that people do know what their role is and why it's happening. It's unbelievable in the amount of transactions that I've worked in that the why why are we doing this is not really articulated very well. So what I would implore you all to do on this call is that, even though it might be a little bit uncomfortable, is to ask whoever's involved in the transaction, if you're not that person that is actually of that level of authority, to understand what the strategic rationale is for the transaction. So, as Mark Twain said, common sense isn't that common. So understanding what the strategic rationale is will get people bought in. So we'll get into some of the slides here. I see Karen, many leaders say they don't have time for due diligence. Yes. Gray, cost, resources, time and money. Yeah, I completely agree. So when we get into doing the post-merger integration, I don't really like using the word post, because post-merger integration needs to start, or should start, 6 months before transaction is even finalized, when you get to closing. And what that allows you to do is mitigate risks. Now, we're not going to alleviate all of the risks in a transaction, but what you can do, if you know that there are big differences in culture in the organization, you know that that's probably where you need to focus your PMI program. So it would be a red flag for me, as somebody who runs transactions, where there is a post-merger integration plan that doesn't have resources on the HR or people and culture work stream, for example. So let's get into the slides. Thank you for everybody that has contributed in the conversation, and I would also really like other people to put their points forward, and we'll try to make this as interactive as possible. So the objectives of this session: what is culture? How do you assess it? Strategic alignment, clarity, and top tips. So the fourth point there, top tips, they're mostly war stories, and they are what I've learned by not doing things the way they should have been done. But sometimes hindsight's a wonderful thing, and you only get it after the fact. So in terms of in terms of culture and what is it? So the definition here is that culture is a system of values, beliefs, and behaviors that influence how work gets done in an organization. We know that to be true because it's essentially, as I think was mentioned in the chat, is how we do things around here. Now, when you're working on a transaction, one of the things that you really want to ensure is that you know how that company operates. Now, that can be quite difficult when you're going through your due diligence process, because, as we know, for those that have been involved in transactions, you have a transaction team. That transaction team is generally a small ring-fence group of senior individuals. It's not the levels below. And that's really where culture exists. One of the things that I've learned through my career is that a lot of culture actually represents itself, and it's a proxy for the processes that are in an organization. So let's use an example. Think about an organization that's acquiring another organization, and they have a very driven, let's say, compensation plan, which is focused on individuals. You have another organization which is very much focused on teamwork. Now, it's not to say one is wrong and one is right, but what it does do, it highlights the fact that you're going to, as part of your post-merger integration planning, have to deal with that. Now, do you take on board one culture or another, or do you combine them into a hybrid? My advice would be is that, as part of the integration strategy, you want to align where you integrate and what cultural aspects you integrate, and it needs to align to the overarching strategy. So if you have a revenue synergy that is a target, you're able to sell more products, services through a certain distribution channel, it probably makes sense to ensure that the sales team, the distribution channels are aligned, and the way they do things are aligned, and it's consistent across the organization. However, if it's more of a cost synergy where you're integrating back office functions, you may want to keep those distribution channels and sales teams separate. So the takeaway is, just because there's a difference doesn't mean you have to integrate it, but you need to align it to what the overarching strategy of the transaction is. So what is culture? Values, implicit beliefs and ideas, is the behaviors, and it's the way people act. I worked on a transaction which we had a very risk adverse organization that was being acquired by a fintech firm. And they had a very different attitude in terms of the way that they approach risk. They had fail fast, fail hard, learn. Now, that was something that we needed to work through, and we needed to harmonize those ways of working. And we did that through processes. In terms of your overarching PMI program, what you'll find is that you need to have a joint, and when I say joint, I mean target and acquirer stakeholders that are involved. So that works because when you have an acquisition and you have an acquirer, somebody from the business that's acquiring the target, and you have somebody from the target working on a joint goal, you really, going back to the point I was making earlier, you're really walking the walk. So we want to do a joint milestone setting, if you like, where you've got individuals from the target business and also the acquiring business working together. And that helps because it breaks down barriers. And at the end of the day, the business of businesses people, you don't buy four walls, a ceiling, and a logo outside. It's the individuals that are inside. And if you don't do this right, what you'll find is that your attrition rate goes up. Your key people that you want to keep tend to leave, and the objectives of the transaction don't come to fruition. So there's some examples here of where things haven't gone right, and I'll call out the one with the Veteran Affairs over in the US. So when they went through a transaction, one of the things that was very prominent was that there was a let's not give bad news kind of culture. And what was very eminent in that was that because the culture of not giving bad news was endemic in the organization that Szynski was managing, what happened was that things were just being put under the rug and they were being brushed and not being dealt with. And if there's one thing that I'm sure all of you know is that we don't like in business, which is surprises. And when things do blow up, hopefully you're ahead of it and you're able to do something about it. So I'll give you an example where I worked on a transaction. It was a London acquirer, and it was a multi-billion-dollar deal for a business over in India. And there's no right or wrong in culture. What we found was that we acquired this business and it didn't have this culture of bringing things to management's attention. It was more around we're doing this right and we want to ensure that we're showing our superiors that things are going well, even if they weren't. Long story short, we ended up with a number of missed milestones on this post-merger integration because we didn't have information reported up to us because the culture of both organizations wasn't integrated. So what did that look like? Well, it looked like we had fires that were happening that we couldn't put out because they were too far gone. Whereas if we had known about it beforehand, then we would have been able to do something. So as the acquirer, we take responsibility because we obviously didn't make it an environment where the organization that we were acquiring felt comfortable to report things when things weren't going right. Far better to catch something when it's 10% wrong rather than 50% wrong. So when we talk about organizational culture, it's not a soft concept. It has been for a while. And I would say what I've seen in industry for the last, say, 5 years, it has more and more traction, as it should. Why it didn't, I'm not sure. I think it comes down to the numbers and people just look at the numbers, but people start to realize and acquirers start to realize that you really do need to ensure that you build out your cultural integration and people planning. You'll see all of the big four, and I've worked for all of them, that they now build out practices and have complete consultancies that are just focused on cultural integration. And you have partners that run those, and I've worked with a number of them. The one point to take away from this, and it's not going to be death by PowerPoint, is that as much as 50% of differential in performance between an effective cultural integration and not. So that's something to take on board. If you're in a situation whereby you have invariably or quite commonly, you take on board a transaction and you're integrating it and it hasn't got the focus, the resources required to do, you only have a short period of time to raise these risks. Now, they may be awkward conversations, but as an integration director on multiple transactions, one thing I learned very quickly, or not quickly enough, depends which way you look at it, it's probably my 10th transaction, was that where things weren't right or there wasn't enough resources or structure to work through the cultural impacts and working through the employee workforce, what you tend to find is that you'd have disharmony across the organization, and you have a period of time to raise those risks. And what does that look like? Most post-merger integration projects will have a steering group, or should have a steering group. And what does that steering group look like? Steering group is essentially a senior executive who, maybe 5 or 6, who are responsible, and maybe the sponsor is in that, and best practice would suggest that they should be. It's the sounding board, and they want to see where the progress is being made on the post-merger integration, but also you need to use that as the integration director as the tool to release any bottlenecks or make approvals that can't be done at your level. So earlier on in my career, I would get given a post-merger integration transaction to do. I'd have a people work stream. I wouldn't have a full-time engagement from the business. I didn't have enough resources and I didn't have enough budget. Now, I was trying to make a name for myself, so I find that I would say, yep, that's fine. We can sort of do this. And I wanted to ensure that we were projecting a progress in terms of the transaction. However, invariably things would fall apart because you can't really do what you need to do if you don't have the resources, as I'm sure everybody on this call knows. So what I found after a period of time, for a few years working on transactions, was that you need to ensure that where you identify issues and you don't have the right resources and support, that you raise that into the steering committee. So to give you an example of that, I worked on a transaction in Paris where we acquired a regional banking network, and they were very different. So if anybody's worked in France, there's 2 Frances. There's Paris and everything outside of Paris. The acquirer that I was working for worked in Paris and had their head offices in Paris, and they were the acquirer, and the regional bank that they were acquiring had a very different way of working. Now, when I took that on board after the war stories and the wounds on my back from previous transactions, I fronted up to the steerco to say, we do not have a cultural integration plan for this post-merger integration. It's been overlooked. We need X and Y to give us the greatest chance of success in terms of being able to deliver the outcomes of this transaction. So rather than taking that as a bag of hammers on my back, I identified it, and within the first 4 weeks up into the first steering group meeting, I presented 3 options and a recommendation into the steering group that had a dollar value associated with it. And this was essentially a let's get things back on track, because we were post-merger integration, we were 1 month into it, and we hadn't done the work that we needed to do. It was an unpleasant conversation, but it was a conversation that needed to be had. And I'd implore you all, when you're involved in PMI work and it's overlooked, which is very much a common theme, that you ensure that you use the governance framework around you and push things forward and get approval or outcomes that you require to be successful to deliver transaction. If you don't get those things, it'll be minuted in the steering group meeting. And you can then say, well, you didn't give me X, Y, and Z. So therefore, the risk of us achieving these things has gone up. And those things need to be documented. So takeaway is, if you're involved in a PMI transaction that hasn't had the relevant input or the relevant resources doing the relevant activities pre-day one, that you highlight that and you give options with a recommendation, because you've got very senior individuals that are in the meeting. They don't really want to know which one of the options they could choose. They want you to say, these are the 3 and this is the one that you need to choose and why. And the kind of questions you'll get back are, have you spoken to this person? What was the process that you went through? And you need to ensure that you can clearly articulate that and give a very clear, this is what I need to be successful. And if you don't have it, it's then documented and needs to flow through to the risk register in this case. So we talk about macro business issues, and if we look at today, that most businesses have very aggressive growth targets. There's cost pressures. I won't go through each one of these, but in terms of where this evolving regulation, we now have home working post-COVID, and how does that impact certain things? You have regulation, we have AI that's coming into. There is no business or industry that's not being impacted by AI, and there's a lot to consider as we go through. So when you look at a culture, specifically post-COVID, and with smart working or working from home, you need to be considering these factors. So a lot of times when you're looking at transactions and businesses that aren't even going through transactions, need to consider workplace flexibility and what's the difference between the acquiring business and the target business. If you look at Elon Musk or Amazon or Google, a lot of these businesses are now going to the point where they're saying we want everybody back in the office. Now, that's something that needs to be considered. Again, there's no right or wrong, but it needs to be considered as part of your PMI planning. Excuse me. So some of the principles that need to be considered are shift culture. You need to align it to business strategy, and that's the overarching theme in terms of your people integration. Because if a person doesn't understand their purpose and how it relates to the overarching strategy, then you're not going to get that buy-in that you're looking for. It needs to be built and shaped by leaders, and I can't stress this enough. The amount of times, and I mentioned it earlier, walk the walk and talk the talk. A lot of times you get the talk, but you don't get the walk. You need to ensure that your senior leaders in any transaction are walking the walk. And I mean that in terms of they're demonstrating the behaviors and they are operating on a day-to-day basis. Now, one of the things that I tend to do is that we give people what I would call emotional safety or psychological safety on any transactions. Now, that shouldn't be my job to do, but what we do is ensure that anybody across the organization or anybody that's involved in the transaction has the ability to call out anyone at any level if they're not behaving and not demonstrating the behaviors in terms of the future culture that we want to move to. And it's really important, back to the point I was making earlier on, where we acquired this business in India. They had a very different culture in terms of the way that they presented problems or they brought issues to management's attention. So you need to be aware of those things. And because we weren't, and we didn't do any cultural integration planning prior to day one, we fell foul of a number of transaction strategy milestones failing. As we know, when we look at culture, it exists below the surface. So back to point two, we need to ensure that people are aligned. It needs to be across all levels of business and not just from the CEO. I've worked on 3 transactions where what the CEO was saying, what the general managers below were saying were 2 different things. As you can imagine, that transaction was a failure. So you need to ensure that there's alignment across all levels. You want to ensure that you build on strengths. And I want to pause on this one because one common mistake that most acquirers make is that they think in a lot of scenarios, not all, that their culture, their ways of doing things are better. In most cases, an acquisition will involve a bigger target that's more mature. However, what I'd like you to do is just pause and look at, as part of your due diligence, what is this organization that we're acquiring better at than us? And then cherry pick. So I'll give you an example where this didn't happen. I worked in Australia on a transaction where a larger bank acquired a smaller bank. And it seems a little bit simple, but it's a good one to elaborate on. The larger organization had a really terrible performance management framework and technology in place. Essentially, the business didn't really give people the opportunity for professional development. It wasn't really aligned to their roles. And you had to do performance reviews on a yearly basis. So sometimes people were getting you didn't do very well 12 months after something had happened. So really not a great scenario. The smaller bank had a fantastic professional development framework in place. And most, and when I say most, it was over 90% of the organization really were embedded and champions of this software, the processes, and how it was working. In that scenario, we didn't have an integration plan around culture and people. We only had a cost out synergy perspective, which was switch that thing off, transfer everybody across to what the acquirer has. Now, in hindsight, and hindsight's a wonderful thing, was that the target business had a far better personal development program, and they engaged their staff in a much more frequent way that got far better outcomes. We transitioned people across to the new platform. We found that people didn't engage in it. It was too complicated. It wasn't something that actually was fit for purpose. And we found that attrition rate went up. So that's an example where we were acquiring a business and ego and hubris was there saying, well, they'll just come onto our platform because we're bigger. What we should have done is say, okay, well, which one is better? Look at what the options were. And yes, there would be more one-off costs of transitioning the bigger workforce onto the new platform. However, that was the right thing to do. Now, I should have taken that up to the steering committee and say, look, we've got this. This is better. And we can define better, but it was a better solution. But it wasn't something that I did. We found that people that were part of the target organization, they weren't engaged. They were actually offside because they realized that what they had was better. And now that they had something that wasn't great, and you saw performance go down and attrition go up. So when I say build on current strengths, that could be current strengths on both the target and the acquiring firm, not just the target. So change by focusing on what's visible. So you have symbols, you have ways of doing things. Do people celebrate quick wins? What's the way of working in the organization? So whilst things are underneath in terms of processes and procedures, now it's what can people see? So when you get to post-merger integration in your first 100 days, which I'm pretty sure that most of you know is pretty critical, and it's critical because you want to ensure that quick wins are established, communicated, and people see and reinforced that this makes sense. You want to ensure that those quick wins are visible. They are presented on the internet. People are rewarded, whatever it may be, but the communication comes out to ensure that people understand that things are on the right track. Obviously, you need your business model and your organizational systems to support those things, and it's sustained by employee behaviors. So at the end of the day, people can set a culture, have a program, this is what we do, but it'll only live by the employees' behaviors. And we need to ensure that employee behaviors are aligned to strategy, and that only happens by doing those cultural shift elements that we just talked about before. So when we look at cultural indices, you have courage, commitment, inclusion, shared beliefs. Those are those things that you can differentiate an organization. On the right-hand side here, you'll see core indices, which you'd expect to have in most organizations. So courage, commitment, inclusion, shared beliefs, those are things you want to understand as part of your cultural due diligence. Again, if you don't have the opportunity to do cultural due diligence prior to day one, and then you're involved in a transaction and you're part of the post-merger integration team, you really want to get a handle on those four things. It's easier to do post-closing, because post-closing, you're not two organizations, you're just one big, happy, dysfunctional family, essentially. But you do have access to more people, documentation. It's a little bit like getting the keys to the house. So even if you had done cultural integration due diligence prior to day one, you still wouldn't have the level of detail that you really would want. So this is where you have an opportunity to go in, speak to the people that are in HR, speak to the general managers, speak to employees to understand how that culture actually works. When we look at the core indices, this is the very basics that you want to ensure that when you're working through a cultural integration of mindsets, is that you want to ensure, is there a collective focus? What's the risk and governance in that business? What's the external orientation and how is it perceived? And what's change and innovation look like in that organization? So certain businesses will live and die by their innovation and what they bring into market. Others, it's more around the perception and external orientation. So it's imperative that you get a handle on those four items. So three levers that I use to drive change and transform culture within an organization. You want to ensure that leadership and strategy is aligned. So that's really around what do leaders say and do. So how are things communicated? What symbols are present? What actions are undertaken? What's the style? Is it very much knee-jerk, crisis management, setting direction, talent development? Those are the things that you need to get an understanding of. Organization talent systems and functions. So rewards and recognition. I'll just pause on this one for a second. It's such a big thing between different organizations and how they reward and recognize people. And a lot of time, people will think about rewards and recognition as a dollar value. Now, what I've seen is that it's not necessarily around a dollar value, and obviously there is an impact in terms of money going into your bank account. But having your manager put his hand or her hand on your shoulder and say, "Great job," can make somebody want to run through a wall for you. It's the way that people behave. Now, I'm sure that most of you have been in organizations whereby you only get pulled out for what you're not doing right. And, we know that that's maybe historic bad behavior. And as people get more mature around like the way that you cultivate and you get motivation in an organization, some of the most motivating things I've ever been involved in, and I've been in industry, I've been in a transaction that was affecting me, not as a consultant. And I had somebody say to me, "No, you're doing a great job." And all I needed at the end of the day, working like 16 hours, was like a positive reinforcement. So those rewards and recognitions aren't just about a monetary value. It's also about how do you recruit, how do you onboard, how does performance management work? I gave that example earlier. What's the organizational structure like and what's the workplace design? Process and tools. How does the work get done? Now, is this an organization that you're acquiring that has strategic planning? Does it have a product launch framework? Does it have a plan? What does the budget and financial reporting look like? What's the purchasing policy? And for example, with technology, how do they engage suppliers? So once you've got those three things, you've got a good understanding about how those things work. What you're able to do then is understand and able to take on board, okay, which things do we need to focus on as part of our post-merger integration planning? So some of the steps to sustain cultural change. Phase one, identify business issues and confirm the vision. Again, it's not that common. It's unbelievable how many transactions actually do not have a very clear vision of why a transaction's happening. And the takeaway here is that just because the CEO has said that they want to drive the revenue, that's not going to get anybody on board that's working at the front end or on a contact services center. You need to tailor the message, align to the overarching strategy, but make it personal for those individuals. So where we did this with a transaction last year for a business in the Middle East, they were expanding into North Africa, and the strategy was grow our top line. I had to have a one-to-one, pretty frank talk with the CEO, and I said, "Well, that's not going to incentivize or motivate anybody." And I said, "We need to dig through that." Essentially, we got to the point where we can sell these medical devices into North Africa, and we can save more lives. Now think about that for a second. If you're told this transaction's happening just to increase top line revenue, if it was me, I couldn't care less. If somebody says, hey, do you know what, by doing this and by you contributing to this transaction, and we're able now to sell these medical devices into this region by executing this post-merger integration plan, that's a hell of a lot more motivating than it is from the original. So spend time ensuring that people understand what their contribution is and why this transaction is happening. Define the current state and identify gaps. So you want to ensure that you go through both businesses and you understand where the cultural gaps or there's need for attention. The takeaway here is that just because there is a gap or there is a wide remit in terms of the way that people behave, it doesn't mean that you have to spend lots of time on it. You need to align it to the transaction value. So for example, on a transaction I worked on, the sales team didn't need to be integrated at all. We wanted to keep two brands completely separate. And that was critical to the transaction because the organization I was working for was seen as old school and not very much forefront of technology. And the fintech firm that was being acquired was. So the last thing we wanted to do is the sales team and the frontline staff speaking in the language and interacting with customers in the way that the acquirer was. So we saw a big gap between the way that they work and what they said, and we just ensured that, well, that's fine. We had control because we had the sales director that was reporting into the group's sales director. However, we kept that part separate because we wanted to retain that cultural element and way of doing things and not dilute it. Build a plan, have your post-merger integration plan that ensures that you have as much engagement as you can with employees, and not just employees, but also suppliers, your community and external stakeholders also. And then you want to ensure that you want to execute and make sure it sticks. And that's something that you tend to find is really difficult because there's a lot of change fatigue that happens when you get involved in a transaction and people are just fed up. They're tired. Invariably, even though best practice says, okay, well, you have BAU and you have integration, but most of the times what happens is that the person gets two jobs and not double the amount of time in a week. You need to track and report. So the tip of the day here is ensure that you have benchmarks when you do your post-merger integration. Very simple one on that is pulse surveys. I know they call different things in different geographies, but you want to ensure that you have a benchmark of what the culture and the sentiment of that target is. So that might be a survey that target is doing on a quarterly basis that shows what the sentiment of employees are in terms of confidence of their role, happiness in the role. It's really important that you benchmark those things as part of your post-merger due diligence, post-merger integration, because what that allows you to do then is that 3, 6, 9, 12 months into the post-merger integration, you can go back to those surveys and results, and you can benchmark them to say, okay, the average employee sentiment and confidence and happiness level was 6. Now we're 6 months into the transaction and now it's a 7 or an 8. That's a good proxy. So ensure that you have those benchmarks as part of your day one. If it's not day one, then between day 1 and 100, and there's no excuse that you shouldn't get that because now you have access to the whole of the organization that was being acquired. Okay, so that gets us to the appendix, and there are a number of pre, during, and post-transaction phase points on here that I think we're sharing these slides with you guys that you will have access to, but I don't want to go through those in too much detail. I'm just realizing we've got like 10 minutes worth of time. But one thing I'd like to do is share with you the tool that I use, and I'm flying blind at the moment, so Iggy and Angel and everybody else, let me know if I'm presenting or not. Just one second. Listen to what they say. What they do is real intent, even, yes, I love it. Yeah, great. And let me just share this. Okay, so back down to making this as practical as possible. So I use this cultural questionnaire as a very basic thing to do, because as we know in life, nothing goes to plan, and we never have as much information as we would like. Now, you could have a cultural questionnaire that goes on for reams and reams and reams, but like at a basic, what you want to do is understand from an individual perspective. You understand, is it individual performance based or teamwork based? Centralized, decentralized? Is the organizational culture formal or informal? People, in terms of, is there a strong respect for employees and emphasis on relationships and well-being, or is they focus on completing work and getting targets hit? So think of that like investment banking or brokerage or that kind of thing. Tradition, consensus decisions, results focused, open communication, competition, political, and attention to detail. So there's not many questions there, but like as you do in your due diligence, this is something that really helps me and my teams. And what we find then is that as we go through this, I go to say the, as I move that out of the way, what this does, let's just say that there's an organization called BAT and ST. We go through these questions through due diligence with a small group of people because they're part of the transaction. But then when we get to day one, what we do then is that we do it with a broader group. Now, as you look through here, you can see the difference, point 0.134 on here. Now, bring your attention to this. I know you've got one organization who is very decentralized and in terms of the structure, and one that is more or less centralized. So what I would expect after doing this due diligence process, I'd expect my post-merger integration plan to include activities to address this. So essentially what your cultural survey will do as part of your due diligence is to ensure that you focus on the right areas. Now, in this here, it seems to be that they're very much similar in terms of consensus and small group discussions. There's not really much you need to focus on there, but this one would be a red flag for me. Not necessarily a red flag, but something I knew that I know I need to do more work on to understand how do we deal with that. Because if you can imagine, if you have back office functions in one organization, which are centralized, that provide services to the whole of the organization, and the target acquirer has an IT, a finance, a marketing team in each one of the business units. Yes, you've potentially got opportunities for cost synergies, but you need to work through what that target operating model is going to look like. So in this instance, our target operating model work needed to ensure that we went from a completely centralized and decentralized two organizations, and what does that target operating model need to look like in the future. So I'll stop sharing there. I know we only got 7 minutes left, and maybe I will pass it over to any questions or to have whoever's doing the hosting.
Hi, Adrian. Yeah, thank you so much for that very insightful and interactive, presentation. We truly appreciate it. So,
and my palm tree.
yeah. So later on, we'll be having a Q&A, but just to really briefly brush through what change is all about. Change Institute is all about embracing personal growth. You can navigate the complexities of our dynamic world as change champions. So we're just not adapting, but actively leading and shaping solutions. That's very rich in what you have said earlier as well. It's about staying engaged and proactive in always shifting landscape. And here in Change Institute, we believe that empowering, people to be change champions is very, crucial these days. We'd like to equip you with tools to navigate change in a constantly changing world. So we don't just give you the solution, we make you part of the solution. And we enable the change in you and also your organization. So we actually have 2 certification programs. So to help you lead change effectively. So our flagship program is Resilient Leadership, guiding people through constant change. This is focused on how to successfully lead organizations in a world of constant change, and also Adrian will be part of it. And our second certification program, which is change management in mergers and acquisitions, which is coming really soon. This is focused on how you can use change management to succeed in M&A. And this is in partnership with our sister company, the Institute for Mergers and Acquisitions and Alliances. So with our flagship program, diving deeper into this, it is comprised of 4 distinct modules designed to bring out the change champion in you. So these are introduction to change management, psychology of change, building the environment for constant change, and leading in a world of constant change. So this program is designed to fit in your busy schedule and can be accepted anytime, anywhere, and you can complete it at your own pace. And so now, as a token of appreciation for watching us live amidst all of the technical issues, so we would like to announce that one of you will be receiving a full Resilient Leadership course absolutely free. So we will be selecting a winner randomly from the list of attendees today, and we will be announcing the winner after the program. So please make sure to watch till the end to finish also the Q&A with Adrian. So, but if you don't win the complimentary course, we would still, give you up to 30% discount on the program. So keep an eye in the box, and we'll be sending you a special coupon. And after the webinar, so please note that this offer is valid only for the next 2 weeks, starting today. So please don't wait too long to sign up. And your journey begins today, begins here. You can scan the QR code so you can dive deeper into the program, speak with me directly. So let's pave our way to transition to tomorrow. So if you have any questions, I'd like to connect further, please don't hesitate to email me at lowland.trompeta at change-institute.org. So thank you for listening. And now let's hand it back over to Adrian for our Q&A session.
Thanks, Lauren. I think the Q&A only works if there are queues. So
Sure.
I'm happy for that. I think everybody would be very bored and log off if I did the Q and the A. So if there are any Qs, any questions, then please let me know. My email is also here for you guys to follow up with. But look, I think it's great that we have individuals that are dial into this, because essentially when it comes down to any business transaction, essentially, it is around the people, and it's engaging people in the right way. So it's fantastic that we have such a wonderful group of individuals that are interested in this, because at the end of the day, what are we here on life, on this planet for? It's like to make a positive difference if we can. And I've been involved in a ton of M&A that has gone terribly wrong, and that's been distressing, not just for me. I've been involved in it. Hopefully I haven't done too many that are that bad, but on individuals that are in organizations where if you don't have the right communication, you'll assume the worst, which normally is not as bad as actual reality. And by doing some of the simple things we just discussed, we can have a more positive impact, not just for the organizations and shareholder value or synergies or whatever it may be, but like on people's quality of life. So I thank you everybody for being on this, and yes, let me know if there are any questions.
Yes, you can type it in on the chat box, guys, if you have any.
This is where you probably have to ask the questions that I've sent through if nobody asks questions.
That's right. So just to clarify, the winner of the free program, free certification program, would be announced this week.
Catherine, are you? So do people have the opportunity to actually speak on this?
Yeah, there should be a.
So maybe you can open it up to everyone, they can just jump in. But that's a funny name, LinkedIn user. So thank you, LinkedIn user. Any tips on building an integration plan? Yes, you're standing on the shoulders of giants. And what I mean by that is that integration isn't rocket science. We're not putting a rocket up in the air and delivering it to the International Space Station and then landing it in the Pacific on a 2020 meter platform like Elon Musk does with SpaceX. So what I mean by that is that there are integration plans and blueprints that you can use, which will get you 80% of the way there. But the takeaway from this, and I always get asked it, which is, could you give me a checklist or an integration plan? Now, yes, we can do that, but then you need to right size it. So, for example, last week we were with an organization that is acquiring a business, and on a day one checklist and integration plan, there's like about 2.5, believe it or not, about 2,500 activities that you could potentially need to do. What you need to do is right size it, and you get down to, in this instance, there's probably about 250 critical day one activities, but you need to look at the 2,500 to see what's relevant and how you right size that for your organization. So I suppose that you want to get your hands on something like that, get a consultancy in that can give you that, but then right size it for your organization. So don't try to create it from scratch. It's been done a million one times before. You could probably even Google some stuff, but start there. So it's like the 80-20 rule. You'll have 80% of the stuff, but then you need to ensure that the 20%, which is basically where all the value is and all of the risks, is right sized, and it is specific to your organization. Thank you, Karen. I'll send you the 100 Bitcoin later for that positive comment.
Guys, you can bring that in on the chat box so that Adrian will be able to answer. We'll give you another couple of minutes.
If there aren't any other questions, one thing I would leave everybody with is that don't back yourself with, you've done this webinar, but obviously it's common sense. And when you get into mergers and acquisitions, people get into the weeds very quickly, and don't be afraid to call out, how are we going to make this happen? What is the plan? Be curious, I suppose. Be curious. If you are given a hot potato to do an integration, then ask the question, well, what have we done around people integration and cultural integration, and what are the kind of things that we need to deliver on? And invariably, what you'll find is that not everything is covered off, and that's where, back to the point I was making earlier on, you want to ensure that you feed those risks up into the steering group meeting, or whatever the governance structure you have in the post-merger integration, and don't carry it on your back like I did for probably about 6 or 7 transactions early in my career. I could see there was no people integration plan, and I just went, oh, okay, that's fine, we'll just plow ahead. And people left, milestones went sideways, and all of a sudden you're left holding the issues, and it becomes your problem. So ensure that you do highlight those things, because it isn't your problem if you've been given the hot potato to do the integration and it hasn't been done. It is your problem to highlight it within that first kind of 4 weeks. Have you got any experience for handling cultural shock between East and West? Great question. Yes, I'm from Wales, and England is next door. So I'm West and England is East. So when it comes to rugby, we always have a little bit of a head-to-head. But what it comes down to is listening, and that famous phrase of, you have 2 ears, 1 mouth. If I look at East, in terms of like the work that I've done over in Japan, and actually involved this morning, we were doing a transaction with South Korea, and how things are different. It's about not trying to enforce certain things. I think it just comes down to understanding. Okay, what is, again, in most cases, is not right or wrong, and even if it is slightly wrong, it's based on whatever we're coming from and our backgrounds, because we've been indoctrinated. It's to understand and be listened, and then say, okay, well, how do we deal with this, and try to get both parties involved to come up with a solution. Again, what I'm seeing from some of these questions is that it's, you don't have to have all of the answers. What you need to have is the right question. The better quality question, the better outcome you're going to get. So it's essentially around understanding what the differences are, bringing people together and say, okay, if this is the outcome that we're trying to achieve and these things are different, what do we need to do? So, in summary, it's listen and try to act collaboratively. And if you're in Japan, just make sure you stay out very late at night drinking lots of shots with the senior managers, because then that goes a long way in terms of the post-merger integration. Hopefully, Dominic, that answered the question. Thank you very much, Evelyn.
Thank you for your questions, guys. So we have another one from our preset questions. So you mentioned the importance of understanding cultural nuances during M&A. So is there any real life example or misinterpreting these nuances that led to these challenges, and how were they subsequently resolved?
Yes. Okay. So to end, I'll use an example. So I worked in France, in Paris, for 6 years, and I was a director in Deloitte at the time, and our team in London wanted to work more collaboratively. Essentially, the French and English weren't speaking to each other, but because I was there and I knew people in the London office, we decided we will be better, stronger together. And that's really interesting if you think about it, because you've got Deloitte that does integration, cultural integration, consultancy, but literally between the London and Paris team, there wasn't anything being done, and they weren't acting on the things that they were selling as a consultancy. But we went to London on the Eurostar, and we got there. It was a great meeting. We started at 9 o'clock, came at 12:30. There was a knock on the door, and then this lady comes in with a little tray at 12:30, and I said, okay, lunch is here. And all of the French partners looked around and they're like, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Sacre bleu. Like, we are going to eat at this boardroom table. And the English partners were like, yeah, we'll get more done. It'll be constructive. And the French guys looked at the sausage rolls and the sandwiches with tomato sauce, and they weren't impressed at all. Anyway, fast forward 3 weeks later, we invited them over to Paris, showed them how it should be done, which is basically start at 9:30. We went to lunch at 1 o'clock, and we didn't come back. So what happened there was that people just got to know people and the human side of things, and however many bottles of wine and cheese and foie gras and duck that we ate, just consolidated. Like, you can have all of these kinds of should do this, but it comes down to that human aspect. So we identified that there was an issue, and then we just worked together to go, okay, let's just get back down to brass tacks, and let's just enjoy ourselves and realize that together we need to work together, and that it'll be better when we understand each other rather than like being in a suit. Let's just get down to understanding and build that. So that worked really well.
Thank you. Appreciate that answer. And of course, I'm sure everyone did. And thank you once again, Adrian, for that very insightful session. We truly appreciate it. So, guys, as we close, just a quick reminder, one lucky attendee from today's session will be awarded our Resilience Leadership Program absolutely free. And for everyone who tuned in live, a 30% off coupon is on its way to your registered email. So it might land on your spam. So please make sure to check your spam folder. And remember, this offer only stands until September 11, 2023. And so for those who will be catching up through the recording, there is still a treat for you. Enroll between September 1st up until the 30th, and you'll secure a 10% discount on the program course. So start your change journey with Change Institute today. So thank you once again, everybody, for attending. Thank you again, Adrian. It's a pleasure
Thank you
being with
guys.
you today,
Have a great day.
and hope to speak with you again soon. Bye, everybody.